think you should see the participants once you get it on the screen, you can see the participants.
I don't see Lenny then.
Okay, if you send me the Zoom link. Forward. Maybe. You have this one?
It's around your office.
FYI for you, Ron, Dr. Mahmood is from Nubia. We're Sudan, and you know, we just took that recent statement again too about Sudan. They came out on the food security statement. Just saying, we're there.
And I think there will be a public issue statement on Sudan and Central Committee.
Oh, yes, no, there has to be, yeah. If not, I'm ready to just put that down.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
No, WCC has a long history of engagement with Sudan and peace issues before the split, all the rest, yeah. Long history.
Are we ready?
No, we can start now.
بس نقرأ أي ديما إمام محمود أي بن برو أي نوبن برو. I greet and bless you in my Nubian ancestors' tongue. My name is Dima Mahmoud. I am Nubian from Kabaja, of what is today called Sudan. And I start by saying, keep eyes on Sudan. We are here at the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. That title will be changed in local years. And we are in so much gratitude to the World Council of Churches for yielding their space for us to be here, to have this most important conversation on African food sovereignty, land, leverage, and liberation. We apologize for the delay in starting, but this is part of what we will be discussing, and this is part of the things we must consider when we talk about African food sovereignty. It is the understanding, the overstanding, and the understanding that all things happen in divine time. We often hear people say when it rains, it pours, and today it's been pouring from tech gremlins to change of location to some of the speakers who I will be presencing, who unfortunately will not be with us today. And no one rushes the rain. As much as when it rains, it pours, no one rushes the rain. So we're exciting. And we are here to talk about African food sovereignty. What does that mean? What does the depoliticization of food mean to our liberation as people of African descent? We have with us here Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker. We have with us the doctor-to-be Alexa White. We have virtually plugging in with us from Kenya, Sister Leonida Odongo. And as Edfu, co-host of this space, we don't do bios. We are meeting as family. You will have the full information of all our speakers and contributors on the document we will be sharing, and it's a growing document of our work as Edfu Foundation on what Black food sovereignty looks like and African food sovereignty at large, the fight for African food sovereignty. I thank you all for being here with us. I invite you to ask more questions as you hear the contributions of our speakers. Each of the speakers will be sharing an angle of the multi-dimensional fight that is our fight for African food sovereignty, for holistic and collective African food sovereignty and what that looks like. So we'll start with Reverend Dr. Angelique to give a grounding and a little bit of the background, particularly from the lens of Pan-Africanism and the fight for food sovereignty. Thank you, Dr. Angelique, please.
Yes. So Dr. Mahmoud, I am so honored to be in your company, a scholar, obviously of high degree, and one who has integrity based in her homeland as well as in the Pan-African space. We thank you so much. It's an honor. Yeah, dear sisters and brothers, Bread for the World is honored to be here with our ecumenical partner of the World Council of Churches. I am honored to serve in both those spaces, but in this moment, I am referring to my role as Senior Associate and Strategist for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement. I am so gratified that Bread for the World sees the importance of the Pan-African lens. The Pan-African lens means that we understand and we see people of African descent, which is the focal point of this whole forum at the United Nations on this week. So we thank you for the regard of this in this moment. Bread for the World was founded in 1974, right here in New York City, which is where we are, right here at the UN. And not far from here, Bread for the World was founded in a local congregation, a local Lutheran congregation. And the pastor said, oh my goodness, we're just overrun by people who need emergency food, and said, we have to go up the river and figure out why people are being thrown down the river. So let's go back and figure out what are the systemic structural issues. And his name was the Reverend, and is the Reverend Art Simon. He is still with us. And he said, we must deal with the structural issues of policy. And that is how Bread for the World was started. So Bread for the World, our primary concern is around looking at the structural, systemic, and policy issues. We do care about food pantries. We do care about on the ground, but we understand we've got to go up the river and see where the river begins. And so that is what we do there. And we have just welcomed this opportunity to work with the Ed Food Foundation as we have this conversation. So what does that mean for us? Every year, Bread for the World identifies concrete policies that are relevant and are, if you will, winnable, right? So we actually put together the pieces of folk on the ground. We start at the ground. We have other colleagues all over the states who are working on these issues and are mobilizing in the congressional districts the voices of the people of faith and the networks of faith to come together to say to the congressional leaders in their districts, here is a policy we need you to get done to ensure that we have a vision for ending hunger and poverty, which is our big vision, because we're people of faith and we believe that that is possible. We need the will and we need to be in prayer. So this year in 2023, we have, which is what I would call our bread and butter issue. Can I use that phrase? And that is the Farm Bill. Bread has always been there to advocate for the Farm Bill. This is foundational to who we are. It is one of the largest bills on Capitol Hill. And every 5 years or so, it is reauthorized. You guessed it, 2023 is the year. And so while we just happily, and I just need to announce this if you didn't know, we just came to bipartisan agreement, and Bread was pushing for that, I might add, between both the the Democrats and the Republicans and the independents to say, we've got to raise the debt ceiling, right? We cannot pay our bills unless we raise the debt ceiling. That just happened like 24 to 48 hours ago. That just happened. So we've all been advocating for that ceiling to be raised. So now that we have that, we are moving, and we have been already moving, having consultative processes around the Farm Bill. Unlike popular perceptions by many, the Farm Bill is both domestic and it is global. And that is such a perfect bill for us because that's what Bread does. We address both domestic and global issues around ending hunger and poverty. The Farm Bill is a huge bill. Not only does it come every 5 years, it is like one of the biggest bills on Capitol Hill, right? So what Bread has done in its wisdom is identify what are the lenses we need to bring to some very specific kinds of things, both domestically and globally. Those three lenses are the following: nutrition. Where are we uplifting not just food, but nutritional food that helps and builds up the capacity and the voice of people wherever they are, including people of African descent. So nutrition, nutritional food, right? And then the second one is equity. Yeah, we understand there are historic inequities. And in this case, particularly with people of African descent, or if you will, African as well as the Pan-African space. And that is why my title is Pan-African, because we understand the historic connections between all people of Africa. So we recognize that, and I had the great honor to work there. So equity, what are those historic issues? Farm Bill addresses some of that. The third one is sustainability. In other words, we're not just talking about the moment around urgencies, but no, how do we build out sustainable life beyond the moment, right? What does that look like? That has to do with issues around climate, et cetera. Go back to the issue about nutrition. One of the major pieces of the Farm Bill is the matter relative to nutrition. And SNAP, the supplemental bill, which really looks at making sure that people who are in the domestic space, the United States, are able to have a step up with having the support of having food on the table. Food on the table. And so we support that. And moreover, we believe there are some adjustments that need to be made. A couple of those include, we need to make sure that we expand the SNAP bill so that to people who are coming out of prison, where we know there's mass incarceration of Pan-African peoples, disproportionately so, because you know the historic issues, that they should not be penalized once they come out of prison to have these benefits, those SNAP benefits. There are states who penalize people for not having food in states whereby when they come out and re-enter into society, they don't get the benefit of the SNAP program. Well, we think that's a problem. So that's one of the pieces around equity that we immediately address. Brett has that intersectional lens. We also believe in a program that is called GusNAP. GusNAP is a wonderful program that actually supplements and provides grants to farmers who are in the business, if you will, of food production. Black farmers in particular have more opportunity to benefit from GusNAP. We work with Black farmers at Bread for the World, and I just want to share with you that we have an official statement that you'll be able to get from Dr. Mahmoud after this time together, where Black farmers who I have the honor of working with from both the continent as well as from the US in particular, it's a network of about 50 to 70 Black farmers. We were just in Kenya dealing with some of the issues that we're dealing with in the Farm Bill. But there's a statement here that Black farmers are saying we have to deal with historic inequities of discrimination and equities, climate change and climate justice, sustainable farming, again, feeding into those three lenses. We got this from Black farmers. Access to markets, that's what GusNAP helps to do. Access to markets and livelihoods, financial and other economic resources, technical support that we know has not been there the way it could and should be relative to Black farmers. And then the key issue of succession, that it's not just a matter of the elders, but the young people who are coming along. How do we make sure that land is obtained and maintained with heir property as well as other means for the next generation that's coming along? And that includes women, that includes girls. We also have the issue of gender. That leads me into the issue of gender. We do have women farmers. And if you look on the continent of Africa, we know who's out there in the agricultural space, right? It's women going to market. It's women who are growing their food. It's women who are growing new seeds, planting new seeds. And that leads us to this third lens of sustainability. Sustainability is all about, if you will, Sankofa. That means being able to fetch, go back, and learn for ways to go forward, right? So there are indigenous practices that we know in the Pan-African space that need to be identified. And the bill, Farm Bill, helps to support research and innovation. And so we're advocating for historic Black colleges and universities and African-led institutions to be able to be a part of that, to increase their leadership around being able to go and fetch, join that kind of Sankofa work. So the Farm Bill matters. I don't have a lot more time to say a lot more about it, but simply to say the Farm Bill matters domestically in the US and it matters globally. And it certainly matters in the Pan-African space. I'm happy to answer more questions later, but that's kind of a quick overview and I'm so honored to share it. So support the Farm Bill and we have an action step for you when it's time.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Connecting these dots between what happens here, and I'm very grateful that your presence mentioned the generational aspect of this fight. And one of the organizations that both EdFood Foundation and the Nubia Initiative have been privileged to connect with and work with, which will be on the list of Black Food Sovereignty Resources. If you're not on our newsletter and you don't receive the Substacks of Edgewood Foundation, please sign up on our website so that you may get access to this document. So on it is one of the organizations that we work with, the collectives that is called Acres of Ancestry, and they work with Black legacy farmers. And the main campaign at the moment is to cancel Pickford debt. So please do find out about that. We will be going into more of this as we relocate and move the portable microphone, and we must thank our brother Pete here for mobilizing the camera. We will be moving to Alexa, sharing with us her researcher work, and again, the various angles to consider in this very multidimensional fight. Thank you, Alexa, the floor is yours.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me here in this space. I'm happy to be surrounded by like-minded people, as well as being able to have a platform to talk about such important issues when it comes to food sovereignty. So my perspective on food sovereignty is within reference to world hunger. So food sovereignty was a coined phrase in the global movement of La Via Campesina in 1996 at the World Food Summit. And then it was further defined in the Declaration of Nairobi, 2007 in Mali. And so I pay attention to the part of the definition that supports people's right to define their own food system and define their own agricultural system. So within reference to scale, so thinking about a farm as a landscape, I think that's really important. And so the world's fed by small scale farming. The problem of world hunger is not a question of how much food is produced, but how it is distributed. If you think about the continent of Africa, there are 33 million smallholder farmers, and they contribute to about 70% of the food supply for the continent of Africa. A lot of people are astounded when I say that because they don't really understand that the food system is just that system. And so food sovereignty and the policies and the modes of farming that come along with that can be separated into two different forms. So we have industrial or corporate farming. So that's what you typically see on television, and they're characterized by a lot of use of pesticides, very large swaths of land that are only growing one crop, and generally are only meant for selling. And then that's compared to small scale farming. So that's what you would think of when you think of, for example, my grandfather. He was a sharecropper in North Carolina, and he was on a farm that was growing a multitude of different crops. And so just like other people who engage in small scale farming, those are family farms, right? To feed their families, feed their communities. There are barter systems. There are different crops that are grown for very culturally relevant reasons. And so typically the land that is farmed or owned by small scale farmers has to pass down, and it's usually strategically located on very sloped pieces of land. So when you think of these small scale farms across the world, very specifically the continent of Africa, generally the policies that allow for land use and allow for us to allow for them to have their farms, they're usually very precariously set. And so when we think about all of these little details and all of these components that create what a farm is, it's really important for us to think about within the context of food sovereignty, the purpose of that land. And so if the purpose of the land is to sustain a family, or if there's a cultural connection to the crops that you're using, that typically is not represented within a political legislature or the details that come along with us understanding how to politicize farming. And that's a global concern. And so my research really looks at specifically the Sustainable Development Goals. And so underneath the Sustainable Development Goals, they're very detailed indicators. And these indicators have very biophysical components that create what we use to kind of regulate food sovereignty, regulate farmers' lives. And my point of questioning is to understand if food sovereignty is really a part of that conversation. Typically, when you look at indicators, not just in the Sustainable Development Goals, but across a lot of farm policies, food sovereignty is not really a component of those discussions. It's very strategic, and the conversations are centered around very quantifiable metrics that don't include the cultural relevance of food, people's access to that food, or the food system in general. And so I'd just like to leave you with the thoughts of thinking about farm scale and what the land is used for in terms of food sovereignty. And yeah, stay tuned for the papers that come out of my research.
Thank you so much, Alexa. This is a great overview and just a glimpse really of the different dynamics here. I'm very grateful that you mentioned, or at least hinted towards, the corporatization and the industrialization of agriculture, the attack on culture in agriculture. Replacing culture with some aspect of entrepreneurship. There's agri-tech, agripreneurship, and agribusiness, and anything that will replace our culture, our heritage. And so what I'd like to invite you to do is, when we're looking at African food sovereignty, we cannot look at it separately or separate from the continued and deliberate attack on all people of African ancestry in terms of heritage, in terms of culture, because it is our continuity. It's the seed. It is the seed. And I wear multiple hats, but I do want to yield to our sister Leonida Odongo. Because of the tech gremlin situation, we are unable to share with you her brilliant PowerPoint presentation, though we will have a link to it on the Google Drive, and it will also be linked on that list of the Google Doc list of resources for African food sovereignty. And I just want to check, do we have Leonida with us online?
Yes.
Yes. Leonida, if you can hear us, the floor is yours to Haki Nawiri Africa. Thank you. We start.
Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Greetings from Ethiopia. I'm actually not in my home, Kenya, and I'm actually attending a session to discuss My Food is African. So it really points out the fact that it's very important for us to appreciate our food as African people, but also appreciate the nutritional value of our food. What I want to talk about is the politics of food and in a globalized world. And this is going to be focusing on looking at it from the lens of an African. One thing I want to point out is when we talk about food sovereignty in the African context, or in a general context, food sovereignty is supposed to be having the power to control what you produce, how you produce it, and also being able to control the distribution process. But if you look at the African context, you find that all that power has been stripped. People have been stripped of the power to produce what they want to produce, because if you look at seeds, the seeds that people are using in the continent is seeds that comes from the agrovet. And who owns this agrovet? They originate from the global north. The owners of the market share in these companies are not Africans. You find that they are white men in Europe and other parts of the world. And the other thing you see, we see happening in the continent, of course, there is the increased land grabs happening. And of course, this is coming with people are getting shot, people are getting killed. I don't know how many of you saw what was happening in Ngorongoro in Maasai Land, and what has been happening in Uganda in a place called Kiriadondo, where the land grab is being done by a multinational corporations, chasing away smallholder food producers from their land and replacing their food production with industrial agriculture. So what's happening, for instance, in the African continent, we are being forced to produce what we don't consume and consume what we don't produce, because the bulk of our food goes to the rest of the world as primary products at very cheap rates. But when it comes back to Africa, we are forced to pay prices that we can't afford. If I can give a good example of chocolate, we're told the best chocolate comes from Switzerland. The question is, how many cocoa bushes does Switzerland have? The bulk of that cocoa comes from Ghana, but the question is, how many ordinary Ghanaian farmers can be able to afford to go to Java and drink the coffee that they produce? So when you talk about food inequalities, when you talk about inequalities in terms of food production, those are the realities that we are facing. Africa as a continent is facing a lot of onslaught in relation to our food production. For example, if I talk about policies, the policies that we have are not policies that are people-centered. We are seeing a lot of footprints of transnational corporations in our food systems and in our policies. For example, in Kenya, we have the push for the lifting of the genetically modified organisms ban, a ban that has been there for the last 10 years. And in a country like Nigeria, we are seeing the push for genetically modified cowpeas. And you all know that Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation. So of course, this means that if the food is converted to genetically modified food, it's creating a ready market for the transnational corporations to sell their products. And of course, this is going to have negative impacts on farmers because it's going to tie them to patents. And patents are not free. Patents actually mean that somebody else somewhere controls your food, controls your heritage, controls your dignity. And of course, we talk about distribution, there are aspects of what we call the trade agreements. And these trade agreements are not favorable for the African continent. However many number of universities we have, however the number of engineers we have, however the number of think tanks we have, food from Africa has been conditioned by international monetary finance institutions to be primary products. If, for example, you're to sell your products abroad, you have so many papers to fill, a lot of bureaucracy to go through, and many a times you get that your products can get rejected at the airport. They say that maybe it's not of the right shape, it's not of the right kilograms and things like that. And if we look, for example, also at the labor systems, you find that in Africa, people are paid very low. Perhaps somebody is working on a farm belonging to a multinational corporations, they're paid very low. And whatever they are producing is sold at exorbitant prices. So when I talk about inequalities and when I talk about food within the African continent, that's the reason why we are pushing for African food, going back to our roots, because we are being told that often what we eat is demonized. We are told that African soils lack fertility, and that's why we are being pushed to use synthetic fertilizers. Like right now in Kenya, we are having a bill that is being pushed that criminalizes the use of manure. We know that animal manure is natural. It has a lot of microbes that are good for the soil, but now we are being told that we are not supposed to be using manure from our cattle. So what we don't know is whether we are going to be using manure in form of pellets that have been converted, or whether this is a push to for local farmers to continue using fertilizers, which is expensive and it's also unsustainable. And part of the reason why we are pushing for indigenous knowledge and indigenous way of food production is because in Africa, and the IPCC report has confirmed, the State of World Food report has also confirmed that Africa, the number of hungry people is increasing. And this is happening despite being a continent that has the most favorable weather conditions in the world, that has the most biodiversity in the world. and a continent that has the most labor, the most youthful labor in the world. And so if you look at all these contradictions, you really see the footprints of transnational corporations in our food systems. And this is why we are resisting, for example, through organizing community-based dialogues where we promote intergenerational learning. We bring elderly community members to talk to us about how food was in the past, to talk to us about food preparation, because there's a push to eat food that gets cooked in 1 minute. You're seeing a lot of people are eating noodles, which is not healthy, and it has implications, for example, on our health. You're seeing, for example, the Africa, 8 countries in Africa have the highest number of obese people. What does that tell you? That tells you that we are not consuming healthy food. And that's why now we need to rethink our food systems. We need to rethink our soil. We need to rethink what we are putting on our tables and on our farms. And that's why we are pushing for food sovereignty, people-centered food sovereignty, decision-making at the local level. And you're also looking at alternatives, for example, bringing back seed banks in the community so that farmers can save and exchange their seeds, bringing back granaries, because in Africa, granaries symbolized food sovereignty, but with the so-called push for modernity, in many villages across Africa, granaries have disappeared. And now there is the push to bring back the granaries because that was symbolic with food sovereignty. Right now, if you go to someone's house, they cannot give you food. You can stay there even for 3 hours without even a cup of tea. But in the African context, through the Ubuntu values, you could not visit someone without being given food. And that's why this is not only a fight for Africans in Africa, but also for Africans in the diaspora, because we have a connection and we need to continue these conversations around our food being African and appreciation of our culture as African people or people of African descent. Thank you. Back to you, Dima.
Yeah? Okay, great. Start over. Thank you, Leonida, for sharing this. And I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper as far as the work you've been doing with the Kenyan Peasants League for the campaigning against the lifting of the ban and the timeliness of whatever deal between Kenya and the US, because the time of that alongside or parallel to the timing of the Cancel Pickford debt campaign and the yields, and now this farm bill, something here needs to be, the dots here need to be connected. And I'm wondering if you could shed a little bit more light on that, maybe 1 or 2 minutes before we go forward.
Okay, thank you. One is that it had not been easy to come up with for the ban to be effected in Kenya. It had been a process of many years, petitions, going through the courts to get the ban effected. But when we had a new political dispensation, amongst the first things that happened was the lifting of the ban. There was actually no explanation as to why this ban was being lifted, although there were a lot of reasons as to why the ban was put in the first place. And one thing was that Kenya was not, as a country, was not ready for genetically modified organisms. Because when you talk about GMOs, we are never sure about the outcomes, the potential outcomes are very often, because these are things that are modified and they are developed in a laboratory. So the uncertainty of their impact their potential impact is often uncertain. And this was one of the reasons as to why there was a ban on it. Of course, we know that there's been a lot of push, especially through the trade sector in terms of creating markets, for example, for GM products, because there's now a lot of push for, of course, increasing market share And so we all know that Africa is the new market frontiers for everything. We all know that different things are being are banned. For example, if you talk about pesticides, we see a lot of pesticides banned in Europe, but they are finding their way in Africa. So the question is, does it mean that the life of Africans is of less value as compared to the lives of people in other parts of the continent? And of course, what I can point out is that countries are taking advantage of the weak legislative systems, corruption, for example, also among politicians within the African continent, that they don't care about the people's health. They only care about profits. And so this is also one of the reasons why we are seeing a lot of push for this. The other thing I can point out is also the laxity, especially, for instance, within the African Union, because you see, it's supposed to be the institution that's supposed to be taking care of the African people, but you're seeing still within this formation, there is push, for example, for harmonization of legislations around seed legislations. And what does this mean? It means that if you have the same similar legislations, it means that, for example, the multinational corporations, when they want to operate, it's going to provide them with a very good opportunity. One example that I can give is the criminalization, for example, that appears on our seed-related legislations. It means that if sharing and exchange of seeds is criminalized, that means that transnational corporations are having a field day in terms of exporting their products to the country. And this also means that they are backed by legislations. And if we talk about harmonization of seed laws, it means that the punitive clauses within our legislations, if you do an interrogation of our legislations, you'll find that all of them in the African continent have clauses that don't allow farmers to save and exchange seeds. And so it means that when these seeds are harmonized, it means that there's going to be more power for transnational corporations. And where do these transnational corporations come from? Their headquarters are in countries like the US and other countries. And of course, every developed nation is always looking at Africa as a market for its product. And this is also backed by our weak legislations. And of course, the concentration on profit making instead of concentrating on the health and dignity of citizens. And so what I can say is that there was a multi-pronged approach in terms of addressing this issue through the courts, through mobilizing people, mobilizing consumers to create awareness on the potential impacts and what does it mean? What does lifting the ban mean? And of course, we saw a lot of media coverage, but also in this media coverage, there was a lot of co-option, especially of scientists. You find that scientists are saying that GMOs are good, GMOs are going to address food insecurity. It's better to be alive today instead of dying tomorrow. But then the question is, what about our biodiversity? What about the indigenous?
Did we?
Lost her.
No, we didn't. That's again the tech gremlins trying to get in the way of the truth because Leonida was laying some fire and some truth that needs to be heard. And she raised a question that I will take to Alexa as far as research, but I want to pause here for a second and give some numbers. And these numbers, if you're familiar with an organization called A Growing Culture, I hope you're supporting. If you're not, please find out about A Growing Culture and the work that they are doing. This is a little, I had the privilege of growing alongside A Growing Culture and consulting with them. Here are some numbers for you. 4 corporations control over 60% of the private seed market. 4 in the world. 4 corporations control over 75% of the global trade market. And 4 corporations control over 65% of the agrochemical market. We spoke about the corporatization of seeds, the monopolization of the attack on African seed sovereignty. And the backing that is available to get some scientists to come out and say, this is actually what works, as opposed to your primitive African practices. Alexa, as a researcher and as someone who looks and is familiar with the funding side, the not so fun side of research, what is the funding that is available for agroecology, for transfer of our indigenous knowledge and an indigenous practice actually be taken into consideration and see how it goes? If you could shed some light into that, please.
So a great deal of the funding for research is by academic institutions. The movements that support agroecology, generally the largest one is Afrikan, but a good portion of that funding is often depends on the political climate. If we're talking about within the United States, as mentioned earlier, Farm Bill typically is geared towards very industrial corporate farming, and agroecology generally isn't even something that is researched among the United States federal government's labs. And then when it comes to agroecology in the academic space, a great deal of fighting has gone on. For example, my advisor research in agroecology, great deal of South America for the past 60 years. And it's been very difficult to kind of operate within those systems, knowing that the greater system that gives us funding, like the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, those are the really big organizations that give funding for academic institutions, comes from the federal government, who doesn't really pay that much of a close attention to agroecology. On a global scale, a lot of the funding is kind of very sparse for agroecology. Whenever I talk about money and farming and the general world, comes up or the World Bank, we already know kind of where that goes, loans and different allocations of funds, knowing that some nations are not in the economic space to satisfy their requirements. So yeah, the space for agroecology and funding is very precarious.
Yeah, I really would like to add a comment here. I mean, she obviously has stated the truth. This is what's going on. But this is one of the reasons why we're here at the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. We have to look at the structural issues that are preventing the sovereignty, the self-determination of people of Africa and people of African descent. And in the United States, this is why advocacy is so important. The people we elect, the people who say they represent us, who live in the United States or in other countries, we have to hold them accountable. And that's one of the reasons why Bread for the World is doing its work. It believes the voices of the people, the democracy of the people, has to stand up and ensure that we're raising up leaders, that we're raising our voices, and that we are being known. So I think we have a lot of structural work to do. Again, that's why we're here at the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, calling for those kinds of structural changes that are perpetuating what was just shared. Agroecology matters. Right now, it matters even more because it's called climate change. It's called climate change. And what climate change is doing is forcing everybody to figure out how it is we no longer abuse the soil, abuse the seeds, because all of us, not just Pan-African peoples, are looking to be fed. So we're in a moment, we're in a very strategic moment
to ensure that we are very much at the center of the conversations that are changing. We just had COP27, right? COP27 identified these things. We just had the summit around food systems. Greg was also there for that with Pan-African farmers. There are some new conversations happening, and we need to be in the leadership, not coming from behind, but people like us around this table and other places to make our voices heard. Because now, some of the historic inequities that were perpetuated against Pan-African peoples is now coming home to roost for all of us. It is Pan-African peoples and other people of color or multinational, multicultural communities who are the ones carrying the burden for climate, right? I mean, we look at Africa, we were just there in Kenya, for example, and looking at places where there is this research that is happening in academic institutions, which is correct. That's a very important place, and that's in the Farm Bill as well. But we need to be present because these issues are systemic and they're structural and they affect everything about our lives as Pan-African peoples. Truth, again and again.
I think we have Leonida back, and usually what I'd like to do is hold space for questions between our speakers. I don't know if with the text situation, we are able to play a video. So just waiting on confirmation for that. In the meantime, I want to present one of, well, our brother who was meant to be speaking, well, had hoped to be speaking with us here, and is unable to join us due to family emergency. We will take a moment to hold them in light, in prayer, and in peace. But I will take a moment to share that project, and it is the project of Brother Omawale Afrika, and it is owned by for Black food sovereignty in the South, from freedom to family. It is a people-powered campaign, and it is a reminder to, although it is centered in on the fight for food sovereignty in the southern area of the United States, the United States, but it connects to all of us. If you are consuming food, you are part of the African food sovereignty. Right? You are part and parcel of the fight for African food sovereignty. And this campaign is calling on all people of African ancestry, and we will again be sharing on the document the link to that campaign. If you can't give, share. And there are many ways that you can share. You can share the actual campaign, but you can also share your stories, because we are all connected, because we are all connected. Find out about that campaign, ask more questions, connect the dots, help that people power campaign grow, flow, and let that truth come out so that it can turn into that.
Eu entrei em um evento do Zoom da ONU para ver quantas pessoas tem.
Quantos tem?
5.
That we know it can be. I want to take a moment to invite you all to stay tuned, because one of the campaigns that EdFood Foundation is launching alongside the Nubia Initiative, Hakinawiri Africa, the African Caribbean Food Heritage Network, Chocolate Rebellion, the Kenyans, Peasants League, and a few others that are escaping me at the moment, responding to the My Food is African campaign that Leonida is now in Ethiopia attending convenings on. Our Food is African is a response to the My Food is African campaign. And it is the intention of it is to activate the eye of the collective, is to activate all the individual memories, connections, thoughts, actions we have with our food. Our food is medicine, our food is history, our food is heritage, our food is geography, our food is power. Our food is sacred, our food is art, our food is everything. How do we connect these stories and how do we weave this fabric that can finally shackle this system and its genocidal tendencies towards our people, all people of African ancestry, all people of indigenous ancestry. And here I take a moment to remind you all that this has been declared a decade of indigenous languages. Food is also a language. Our food is our language. It's a love language for us. And to connect to all these pieces. So we will be rolling this out at some point in June. Please do stay tuned. If you're not already following EdFood Foundation on the social media platforms, please do, because we will be calling on you. We want your stories, because they're not just your stories complete our stories. And that's how we get the full picture. So stay tuned on that. Now I want to take a moment to switch hats. I've been speaking from my capacity as EdFood Foundation, as a board member, as the Chiefess of Strategy of the EdFood Foundation. I want to shift now hats and speak with you as the Nubia Initiative, as the co-founder of the Nubia Initiative. And I want to more intentionally speak to you as a Sudanese, because that is my personal connection to the fight for food sovereignty, the African fight for food sovereignty. As I said, I am Sudanese. The full name of my country is Bilad Sudan, translating to the land of the blacks. Sudan has been studied and recognized as the world food basket. And I want everyone working, fighting for African food sovereignty, for Black food sovereignty, to just take a moment and sit with the fact, with the truth that the world food basket is literally called the land of the blacks. And it is being ravaged right now by two genocidal war criminals. And as people of Sudan, we continue to see the world not see us. We continue to hear the world not hear us. We continue to hear them say, negotiate with the military, as we have consistently and continue to say since the end of 2018, no more military rule. In 2016, I co-founded the Nubia Initiative with my sister, Professor Dalia Mahmoud, to protect, preserve, and promote Nubian heritage, culture, and languages. And in my naivete at the time, I thought this would be possible from a non-political stance. And thinking of, labels and how we are going to sustain this and the funding, and that if this has anything to do with politics, it definitely will not get funded. So let's go non-political. Because we've also seen what happens when Nubians try and get political. We get squashed. We get arrested for going out on the streets and drumming. And if we're connecting the dots, I think here in this land, Black people were banned from drumming as well at some point. Wasn't there a law for that? So let's just keep those dots there. Another thing that I wasn't conscious of is that our mission actually called our culture endangered. I wrote that. Our mission called our languages endangered. And that was me falling into the system. That was me peddling what the system wants us to believe. Our culture is not endangered. We as a people are. The people who practice this culture are endangered because we are being killed. We are being slaughtered. We are being forced out of our homes. And we are being forced to bear witness to that, evacuate our own people, create the safety, be our own ambassadors, be our own journalists. And the silence of the world is deafening. The fight for African food sovereignty is not just about food. Just like our revolution in Sudan, which this war is attempting to thwart, is not just about Sudan. Both are about Black power. Both are about the collective liberation, the holistic liberation of people of African ancestry, because it's a revolution of consciousness, as much as our fight for food sovereignty is a matter of consciousness, because it's a matter of us connecting to everything that has been divinely created. And I really, really wish I could share that video with you, because that queen that is Petronella from Zambia has said it best. It will be on that document, so please sign up, reach out to us so that we may share this information with you. I close by reminding you that the fight for African food sovereignty is a fight for our heritage, and African heritage is rooted in community and continuity. I want to yield to our speakers. I don't know if Leonida is back here, but I know that Alexa has a hard stop at 2. So I want to take a moment to give the mic back to you. Alexa, if you have any remarks, any questions that you want to leave our audience, our family that are watching with. And if there's a call to action, thank you.
I appreciate the space. Oftentimes at the PhD student, I'm very often surrounded by predominantly white institutions, predominantly corporate farming ideals, and so this is a very sensitive space for me to be able to be a part of. I'd just like to leave all of you off with just the idea that these spaces are very necessary. At least from my perspective as an academic, I feel as though the level of engagement from where I have gained my knowledge for the most part is very limited, and in order to have any sort of change, it requires spaces like this. I also would like to bring attention to the kind of diversity that is food sovereignty. It is thinking about land, it is thinking about scale, it is thinking about how our everyday meals are incorporated into the system that is agricultural change and food systems change. And the fact that the continent of Africa feeds the world. The continent of Africa has the majority of smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers are known to be able to feed the world. And the only reason that world hunger exists is because of how broken our food system is. And thank you for listening.
I just want to thank Dr. Mahmood and my other 2 sisters who are part of this very timely discussion. For those of us at this table, this is not just a theoretical conversation. This is not just a scholarly conversation. It's not just a policy discussion. This is a discussion of the heart. This is a discussion of the soul. And at every level in the Pan-African space, that's what Pan-Africanism is. It is a space also for the soul and for the heart. As we go forward and we think about what changes could happen, we must bring our heart to this work. We must bring our mind and our soul to this work. All of us are in this together. We must raise our voices, not only for Pan-African peoples, although that's what this conversation is about. We must do it for all of us. When Pan-African people are supported and found a community of solidarity, all of us win. All of us win. So we invite everyone to be a part of this journey. Food sovereignty matters. It is unacceptable, the things that we have said today that are unacceptable. One of the pieces I will add in the Pan-African space in the United States at the early part of the 1900s, 19 to 20% of the farmlands were owned by people of African descent after the enslavement period. Oh, I should really say after the 12 years of the so-called Reconstruction period. This is 2023. And the stats show, some want to be gracious and say 2%. Others say less than 1% of those farmlands are owned by people of African descent in the United States. This is not something that just happened. This was a systematic assault of the policies and the practices of people who did not see the vision of beloved community. They decided to follow another vision that was exclusive, that was segregated, and very much unacceptable. Jim Crow laws, sharecropping practices, yes, taking over lands that did not belong to people who were, unfortunately, yes, white settlers and white planters. We have to talk about race in this conversation. It was a systematic assault. And the same happens on the continent with land grabbing. It's happening now, and it's unacceptable. So we must lift our voices, and we must be held accountable. And we must continue to not only dream, as Dr. King said, but we must make for actions that move us toward the dream. Lift your voice, be a part, be in solidarity, embrace diversity, and let's be the beloved community we're called to be. I will end with an action. At Bread for the World, we do letters. Some people don't want to do the heavy lift of protest. They don't want to do the heavy lift of some other things. You can write a letter, you do email, or you do Instagram, or you do Twitter. Write a letter. Bread is here to help you write a letter in this moment to support the Farm Bill. But listen, your voices matter otherwise, because we know the issues of the Farm Bill are intersectional. I thank you for the space.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and we ask Leonida if you have any closing remarks. 2 minutes. If you can hear us, give us a thumbs up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I have connectivity, a bit of connectivity issues. One thing I want to say is that when you talk about our ancestry as African, we are all interconnected irrespective of where we are in whichever part of the world. And slavery, colonialism, and post-colonialism are intertwined, and they're still impacting us as Africans. Even despite the fact that slavery was abolished, we are still suffering, whether in Africa or out of Africa. And this really calls for continued collaboration, continued learning and unlearning, continued working together in different spaces. Our food has been demonized. Our culture is downtrodden. The names that we have for our indigenous food, for example, our indigenous vegetables, are demonized. For example, names such as pigweed, bird millet, monkey bread are derogatory names. It's time for us to reclaim our dignity as African people And I call upon the participants in this space to look for spaces that they can continue to champion and continue these conversations, to identify organizations that they can continue supporting, that continue to advance the cause of the African people, to continue learning and unlearning, and to continue changing the negative dominant narratives about Africans, about what we eat, about how we are, and even about our dignity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leonida. Always with the great reminders and the great closings. And yes, definitely this conversation is to continue. What's coming to mind is actually a message from yesterday's session on faith and liberation. And it was from the matriarch. And she invited us to ponder what happens when the new master looks like us. I invite you to look at the continent of Africa. The masters or and if we're not careful, we're going to keep asking this question for so much longer. And this is why we have to be intentional with our words. And this is why I invite you to call out any contradictions and eradicate them. Invoke our ancestors' tongue, invoke this language, invoke our food, invoke our power, invoke our community. Remind yourself, because when you remember, we all remember. We remember that we are one. And that whether they like it or not, we've already won. So ask more questions, connect the dots, and join us in any way you can. Because again, as long as you're consuming food, you are part of the fight for food sovereignty. Find out how you activate the I in the collective. Thank you, and keep your eyes on Sudan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.